Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and in this video we're going to be learning about the bishop's opening. So we're going to be talking about how to play it and also what to watch out for from your opponent. So the bishop's opening starts after e4, e5, and then bishop to c4. And here there are about 4 main moves for black. There's knight to c6, d6, bishop to c5, and then knight to f6. So I'm going to mainly go over knight to c6, bishop c5, and then knight to f6. So let's start with knight to f6. So if your opponent goes here, there are a few main moves you could do. You could play d3, of course, making a little pawn chain. You could play knight to c3, just protecting the pawn, or you could also play knight to f3. Now, if you play knight to f3, it is a little bit dangerous because, yes, they can take the pawn, and no, you can't or you shouldn't take the pawn on e5. If you do this, it's not very good for you after they play something like d5 here, because then your bishop has to go back, or you can play d3. If you play d3 though, then after they take and you take, then they're just going to take the queen, and then you lost your castling rights. So it's just a kind of a nasty position. So you don't really want to take the pawn here. What you could do though is you can play knight to c3. And so they're either going to have to take or move back, and if they take here, then you can take with the d pawn, and then now your position it looks much better because you have 2 active pieces. Your queen could get active very quickly as well. You could also castle, whereas they can't castle yet. So this is one of the main ideas after they go knight to f6 is just playing knight f3 would be a potentially good move here. Now let's look at bishop to c5. So if they play this move, there are a few main responses for white. You could play knight to c3, you could play d3, creating a pawn chain, you could play knight to f3, going after the weak pawn, and all those are very good ideas. And you could also play this move d4 though. And so this kind of makes black have a decision. So they kind of have to make a decision. Do they want to take with the pawn or with the bishop? And so if they take with the pawn, then it's actually much better for white, because now you can sacrifice or momentarily sacrifice the bishop. After king takes, then you play queen to h5 check, and then once the king moves back or they play g6, then you're just going to pick up the bishop, and then white is pretty good here. Because they have an active queen, the king can't really castle, he's kind of out in the open. You're going to play something like knight f3 once it's your turn, and then you're going to get your pieces ready to attack the king. And going back, if they take with the bishop, then you can play knight to f3, and you're attacking the bishop and the pawn at the same time. And if they play something like knight to f6 here, then you can still just take the bishop, and then they retake, and you take with the queen, and you have an active queen and bishop, so your position's better. So they wouldn't really do something like that. If they did, it would just be better for you. If they play the pretty good knight to c6 move, then you can still take, because it forces a trade basically, so the pawn or the knight has to take now. If the knight takes, then you have this move bishop to e3, and so it's kind of the same thing now, because you're attacking the knight. If they allow you to take the knight, then you're just going to pick up the pawn with the queen as well. And so here they're kind of forced to go back. If they play something like this, thinking, well, now if they take, then I can defend the pawn. That's not actually the case, because here you can just play knight to c3, and then you're planning to go d5 after that, and then attack the queen, and also threaten to pick up the pawn on c7, which would be forking the rook and the king at the same time. So here they would kind of have to go back to c6, and then your position would just be a little bit better. You could also play something like queen g4 here, going after this weak g7 pawn now, or queen to h5 would also be a decent move. And if they decide to take with the pawn, then just know that your best option is to castle here, and then you just continue to develop something like bishop out, or once they do something like this, then you have opportunities of pinning the knight. Stuff like this would be decent options for continuing the game. They might castle next move, something like that. And the last move we're going to talk about is knight to c6. So here, it's kind of similar moves you could play. You could play d3, you could play knight to c3, you could play knight to f3, just regular developing moves. I kind of like the idea of playing d3, because usually your opponents are going to play something like knight to f6 or bishop to c5. If they play bishop to c5, there's this idea of playing bishop to e3 here, and you're kind of allowing them to take the bishop, and then you take with the pawn. And then here you kind of have a few more pawns in the center than they do, so you can push for advantage later, and then you have pawns to back up the pawn on d4 if you decide to push that later on. And then you can also do stuff like after they play something like this, then you can play knight to f3 and then castle, and then your rook is going to have this nice semi-open f file to play with as well, and then the bishop's also already hitting that pawn, so it'll make for some good tactics later on. And another idea for white here, if you play knight f3, then you're almost ready to castle, so you just can castle your next move if you wanted to, whereas black, they don't even have any of their pieces out on the king side, so that's kind of a little bit of an advantage for white, because then they can already start, putting their rooks on the middle files and then start trying to press for advantage in the middle of the board. And so yeah, that's all I have for this introduction video for the bishop's opening. I hope y'all enjoyed this video or just found it helpful in general. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching.